"The bank is preparing to foreclose on your property, Ms. Whitmore." Those were the words that changed everything. For a moment, I thought the woman on the phone had made a mistake. I was 68 years old, sitting at my kitchen table in Cedar Falls, Iowa, sipping lukewarm coffee while the morning sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. The property she mentioned was the old Whitmore family home, the place where my brother Thomas and I had grown up, the house our father had spent 40 years paying for. "I'm sorry," I said carefully. "There must be some confusion." The representative paused. I could hear papers shifting in the background. Then she read the address. Every digit was correct. Every word landed like a stone in my stomach. I stared out the window at the maple tree in my yard and felt something cold settle deep inside me. "Foreclose," I repeated. "How can there be a foreclosure?" The woman sounded uncomfortable. "A mortgage loan secured by the property has fallen into serious delinquency." Mortgage loan. The phrase made no sense. The family home had been paid off years ago. My father used to joke that the day he mailed the final payment was the happiest day of his life. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat motionless. The kitchen suddenly felt too quiet. The clock above the refrigerator ticked steadily while my coffee cooled beside me. My father had passed away 7 years earlier. My mother had followed him 2 years after that. Since then, Thomas had handled most of the paperwork related to the family home. I never questioned it. He was my older brother. He lived closer. He always seemed confident when dealing with documents and legal matters. Trust came naturally when someone had been part of your life for nearly 7 decades. Yet something about that phone call refused to leave me alone. I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and pulled out an old folder containing copies of family records. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through aging papers. Tax statements, insurance documents, old maintenance receipts. Nothing mentioned a mortgage. Nothing explained why a bank believed it had a claim against our family home. The more I searched, the heavier the silence became. Around noon, I called Thomas. It rang 4 times before he answered. "Margaret," he said cheerfully. "Everything okay?" I hesitated. "I got a call from a bank this morning." The cheerful tone vanished almost instantly. "A bank?" "They said the family house is facing foreclosure." A long pause followed. "Too long." "You shouldn't worry about that," he finally said. "It's probably some clerical issue." His answer should have reassured me. Instead, it made my pulse quicken. "What kind of clerical issue?" I asked. "These things happen," he replied. "I'll look into it." Then he changed the subject. He asked about the weather. My garden. A neighbor he barely remembered. The conversation felt forced, as though he were trying to move past something neither of us wanted to name. When we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone. I realized I couldn't remember the last time Thomas had sounded nervous. Not when our father died. Not during difficult family decisions. Not even during his own health scare years ago. But today, for just a few seconds, I had heard uncertainty in his voice. That afternoon, I drove 20 miles to the old Whitmore house. The white paint was fading. The porch sagged slightly on one side. Yet it still looked exactly like home. Standing in the driveway, I remembered birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and summer evenings when our father sat on the porch telling stories until the stars appeared. This house carried our family's history. It was never just lumber and nails. It was a promise. As I stood there looking at it, one question kept echoing in my mind. If there was truly a mortgage on this house, who had signed it? And why did I suddenly fear that I already knew the answer? That evening, I did not drive straight home. Instead, I sat in my car across the street from the old house and watched the sunlight slowly disappear behind the trees. The porch light that my father installed 20 years earlier flickered on automatically, just as it always had. Seeing it brought back memories I had not visited in years. My father believed that a home represented more than property. He used to say that walls protected people, but memories protected families. As children, Thomas and I heard those words so often that I could still remember the sound of his voice saying them. Yet sitting there now, I could not stop thinking about the tension I had heard in my brother's voice earlier that day. The next morning, I opened a storage cabinet in my basement where I kept old family boxes. Dust coated the cardboard lids. Most people would have thrown those things away years ago, but I never could. Inside were photo albums, tax records, greeting cards, and documents my parents had carefully saved. I spent hours sorting through them. Around noon, I found a faded envelope labeled estate planning. My heart skipped. I carried it upstairs and spread the contents across my dining room table. There were copies of insurance forms, notes from meetings with attorneys, and handwritten instructions from my father. One page caught my attention immediately. It was dated less than a year before he passed away. In neat handwriting, he had listed several assets and how they should be handled. Next to the family home, he had written a simple sentence: equal interest for Thomas and Margaret. I read the line 3 times. Then I read it again. Equal interest. Not Thomas alone. Not a transfer to one child. Equal. A feeling of relief briefly washed over me because it confirmed what I had always believed. But that relief lasted only a few seconds. If my father intended equal ownership, how could a mortgage have been placed on the property without my knowledge? I picked up the phone and called the county recorder's office. After navigating several transfers, I reached a woman who explained that property records were public information. She told me exactly where to go and what documents I could request. Her helpful tone contrasted sharply with the growing anxiety inside me. The following morning, I drove nearly 30 miles to the county administration building. The structure was older than most offices, with polished stone floors and long hallways that echoed with footsteps. I filled out several forms and waited while an employee searched the archives. 20 minutes later, she returned carrying a thin file folder. At first glance, there did not seem to be much inside. Then she opened it and pointed to a property transfer record. My eyes moved slowly across the page. There was the address of the family home. There was my father's name. Then there was Thomas's name. Only Thomas's name. I stared at the document, convinced I was misunderstanding something. The employee politely stepped away to assist another visitor while I continued reading. According to the filing, ownership had been transferred several years earlier. The signature section was partially blurred from age, but one detail remained painfully clear. My name appeared nowhere on the document. I felt suddenly cold despite the warm building. Questions rushed through my mind faster than I could process them. Why had Thomas never mentioned this? When had this happened? And most importantly, how had ownership apparently changed without a single conversation between us? As I carefully returned the file, another thought settled heavily over me. The foreclosure notice was no longer the mystery. The real mystery was my brother. I drove home in silence that afternoon, barely noticing the rolling fields outside my window. My mind kept returning to that property record. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the questions had multiplied. I made a sandwich, poured a glass of iced tea, and sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing. For years, I had trusted Thomas to manage the details surrounding the family home. After our parents passed away, he volunteered to handle taxes, maintenance, and paperwork. At the time, it seemed practical. He lived only 15 miles away while I lived nearly an hour from the property. I never imagined that trust could create such a blind spot. The following morning, I decided to visit Thomas without calling ahead. If there was an explanation, I wanted to hear it face to face. His house sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees. When I knocked on the door, his wife Linda answered. Her smile appeared for only a second before fading. "Margaret," she said. What a surprise. Something about her expression immediately put me on edge. She stepped aside and invited me in, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. Thomas appeared moments later from the living room. He looked startled. Not guilty. Not angry. Just startled. "You should have called," he said. I studied his face. "I wanted to ask you something." He glanced briefly toward Linda before looking back at me. It was a small movement, but I noticed it. "About what?" he asked. I took a slow breath. "The family home." Silence settled over the room. Linda suddenly became interested in arranging magazines on a nearby table. Thomas folded his arms. "What about it?" I told him about the records I had reviewed. I told him about finding his name listed alone. His expression tightened. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he shrugged. Dad wanted things handled that way. The answer landed heavily between us. Then why did he tell me the exact opposite? I asked. Thomas looked away. "You probably misunderstood. I had known my brother for 68 years. I knew when he was confident. I knew when he was uncertain. And I knew when he was avoiding the truth. This was avoidance. Did you take out a mortgage?" I asked quietly. His jaw shifted. "That is none of your concern." The response shocked me more than any admission could have. Thomas had never spoken to me that way before. Not once in our entire lives. I stood slowly. "The bank seems to think it is my concern." Linda finally spoke. "Margaret, you are making assumptions." Her tone was calm, but there was tension beneath it. "Then help me understand," I replied. Neither of them answered. Instead, Thomas walked toward the kitchen and began talking about a plumbing issue he was dealing with. The subject changed so abruptly it felt almost rehearsed. 10 minutes later, I left with fewer answers than when I arrived. Yet one thing had become painfully clear. They knew more than they were willing to admit. That evening, I sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. My father's old envelope remained on the table beside me. I opened it again and reread every page. As darkness settled across the yard, one realization became impossible to ignore. The documents at the county office and my father's written instructions could not both be true. Somewhere between those two versions of reality, something had happened. And for the first time since receiving that call from the bank, I stopped wondering whether there was a problem. I knew there was one. The only question left was how deep it went. The next few days passed in a strange haze. I continued with my normal routines because I needed something steady to hold on to. I watered my flowers each morning. I walked to the mailbox every afternoon. I attended church on Sunday. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, however, every quiet moment was occupied by questions. Late Tuesday morning, I returned to the county administration building. This time, I asked for every document connected to the family property over the last 10 years. The clerk disappeared into the records department and returned nearly half an hour later carrying a thicker file. I settled into a chair near a window and began reading page by page. Most of the documents were ordinary: tax assessments, maintenance permits, routine filings. Then I found something that made me stop. Several years earlier, a transfer affidavit had been submitted shortly after my father's death. Attached to it was a notarized statement referencing ownership rights. I studied every line carefully. The language was technical, but one detail stood out. The notary who witnessed the paperwork was someone I recognized. Her name was Carol Bennett. Carol had been a longtime family acquaintance. She lived only a few miles from the old Whitmore house. More importantly, she had retired nearly 6 years ago. Yet according to the date on the document, the notarization had occurred almost a year after her retirement. I read the page again, then again. A knot formed in my stomach. It might have been an innocent explanation. It might have been a clerical error. But after everything I had already discovered, I could no longer dismiss unusual details so easily. On my drive home, memories began surfacing from years earlier. Small moments I had forgotten. Conversations that seemed insignificant at the time. I remembered Thomas repeatedly encouraging our father to simplify the estate plan. I remembered him volunteering to organize legal files. I remembered him insisting that paperwork only confused people and that he would handle everything. Back then, his behavior seemed helpful. Now it looked different. Not suspicious exactly, just different. That evening, I searched through old family photographs. One image showed my father standing proudly on the front porch beside Thomas and me. We were all smiling. Looking at that picture hurt more than I expected. Families are built on assumptions. You assume honesty. You assume loyalty. You assume the people who shared your childhood would never intentionally place themselves above everyone else. Yet assumptions are fragile things. Once cracked, they rarely fit together the same way again. The following morning, I decided to visit Carol Bennett. Her small white house sat at the end of a quiet country road. She answered the door herself. Age had slowed her movements, but her eyes remained sharp. When I explained why I had come, her expression changed immediately. She invited me inside and listened carefully while I described the documents I had reviewed. After a long silence, she shook her head. "Margaret, I retired before that date," she said softly. I had already surrendered my commission. My pulse quickened. "Are you certain?" She gave a sad smile. "Absolutely certain." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The room felt suddenly smaller. Carol eventually reached across the coffee table and gently touched my hand. "Something about this does not sound right." As I drove home beneath a gray afternoon sky, I realized the situation had crossed an invisible line. Until now, I had been chasing inconsistencies. Now I had encountered something far more troubling. For the first time, I began to wonder whether the truth was not merely being hidden from me. Perhaps it had been carefully constructed from the very beginning. The next step was one I had been avoiding. Until now, I had gathered documents, reviewed records, and followed questions wherever they led. But I had not spoken to anyone with the legal experience to interpret what I was finding. On Friday morning, I scheduled a meeting with Ethan Brooks, an attorney who had worked on several estate matters for people in our county. His office occupied the second floor of a red brick building near the courthouse. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. When I arrived, I carried a folder thick with copies of every document I had collected. Ethan greeted me warmly and listened without interruption as I explained everything from the foreclosure notice to my conversation with Carol Bennett. He took careful notes and occasionally asked a question, but mostly he listened. After nearly an hour, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Margaret," he said gently, "there are enough irregularities here that I believe a deeper review is necessary." Hearing those words brought no satisfaction. Part of me had hoped there was still a simple explanation hiding somewhere beneath the confusion. Instead, every answer seemed to reveal another question. Ethan spent the next several minutes examining the documents one by one. Eventually, he stopped at the property transfer record and studied it closely. "Did your brother ever provide you with copies of the estate settlement?" he asked. I shook my head. "He always said he was handling everything." Ethan nodded slowly. "That is what concerns me." He explained that when family assets are transferred after a death, there is usually a clear trail of supporting paperwork. The absence of certain documents was unusual. The presence of other documents raised concerns of its own. None of it proved wrongdoing, but none of it inspired confidence either. Before I left, Ethan asked permission to obtain additional records directly from public sources and lending institutions. I agreed immediately. As I walked back to my car, I felt emotionally exhausted. The situation had become larger than a disagreement between siblings. It now involved lawyers, lenders, government records, and questions about events that stretched back years. Over the following week, Ethan and I exchanged several phone calls. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, he called with information that left me staring silently at my kitchen wall. Several years earlier, shortly after ownership records changed, a substantial loan had been secured using the family property. The amount was far larger than I expected. I asked where the money went. Ethan paused before answering. "We are still tracing that." After the call ended, I sat alone for a long time. The realization settled heavily over me. This was not a recent mistake. Whatever happened had happened years ago. Someone had made decisions. Someone had signed papers. Someone had benefited. As evening approached, I opened an old photo album and found a picture of Thomas and me standing beside our father during a 4th of July picnic. We looked happy, ordinary, like a family that trusted one another completely. I ran my fingers across the faded photograph and wondered at what point that trust began to disappear. Had it happened suddenly? Or had it happened so gradually that I never noticed? The following morning, Ethan called again. His voice sounded more serious than usual. "Margaret," he said, "I think we finally know where the money went." The silence after Ethan's statement seemed to stretch forever. I tightened my grip on the phone and stared out the kitchen window. The maple tree in my backyard swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, completely unaware that the foundation of my family history was shifting beneath my feet. "Where did it go?" I finally asked. Ethan took a measured breath. "Most of the loan proceeds appear to have been directed toward a business venture." I frowned. "Thomas never owned a business." "Not officially," Ethan replied. "But records show he invested heavily in a commercial development project about 5 years ago." I felt my stomach sink. Suddenly, scattered memories began resurfacing. I remembered Thomas mentioning investment opportunities during holiday dinners. I remembered him speaking confidently about future profits and financial independence. At the time, I paid little attention. My father was still alive then, and conversations about money rarely interested me. Now those memories carried a different weight. Ethan continued explaining what he had found. The project initially appeared promising. Several investors participated. Large loans were secured. Development plans moved forward. Then market conditions changed. Costs increased. Delays piled up. The project struggled. Eventually, investors began losing money. Thomas, it seemed, had lost a significant amount. After ending the call, I sat quietly for nearly an hour. Not because I was angry, not because I was shocked. I was trying to understand how someone could convince himself that risking a family home was acceptable. The house represented generations of effort. My father worked overtime shifts for years to keep up with mortgage payments. My mother clipped coupons and saved every dollar she could. Their sacrifices were built into every wall and floorboard. Yet somehow that history had become collateral for an investment. 2 days later, Ethan called again with additional information. This time, his voice carried a different tone. "There is something else you should know." I immediately felt uneasy. "What is it?" "The loan payments stopped nearly 18 months ago." I closed my eyes. 18 months. Yes. That meant foreclosure had not appeared overnight. It had been approaching slowly for more than a year. Notices had likely been mailed. Warnings had likely been issued. Deadlines had likely passed. Throughout all of it, nobody had contacted me. Nobody had explained anything. Nobody had given me an opportunity to help protect the property. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because of the money, because of the secrecy. That evening, I drove to the family home again. The sun was beginning to set when I arrived. I parked in the driveway and walked slowly around the property. The porch steps creaked beneath my feet exactly as they had when I was 12 years old. The old oak tree still stood beside the garage. The kitchen curtains my mother sewed decades ago remained visible through the window. Everything looked familiar, yet everything felt different. Standing there, I realized the house itself was not what I was fighting for. Houses can be repaired. Mortgages can be resolved. Legal disputes can eventually be settled. What troubled me most was discovering how much of my family's story had been hidden from me. As darkness settled across the yard, I made a decision. I would not confront Thomas again. Not yet. The documents were speaking more honestly than people were. Ethan agreed. We needed facts, not arguments. We needed records, not explanations. If there was a complete truth buried beneath years of paperwork and silence, I intended to find it. And somewhere deep inside, I had begun to suspect that the worst discovery had not surfaced yet. For the next several weeks, I followed Ethan's advice. I remained patient. I did not call Thomas. I did not confront Linda. I did not reveal what I had learned. Instead, I continued living my life exactly as before. If anyone was watching, I wanted them to believe nothing had changed. It was not easy. Every family photograph on my walls seemed to ask questions I could not answer. Every memory carried a shadow of uncertainty. Yet the more distance I created, the more information seemed to surface. One afternoon, Ethan invited me to his office. When I arrived, several folders were spread across his desk. He pointed to a collection of financial records that had recently become available through public filings connected to the failed development project. "I think we have a clearer picture now," he said. He explained that Thomas had invested far more money than anyone realized. When the project began struggling, additional financing became necessary. Investors were encouraged to contribute more capital. Some walked away. Others doubled down. Thomas chose the second option. As Ethan spoke, I felt a growing sadness rather than anger. I knew my brother. He had always hated failure. Even as a child, he would spend hours trying to master something if he thought he was falling behind. The thought of losing money publicly would have been difficult for him to accept. Unfortunately, pride often convinces people that one more risk will solve every previous mistake. According to the records, that was exactly what happened. The mortgage was not used to create wealth. It was used to rescue losses. Ethan slid another document across the desk. "There is something else." I looked down. The paper listed communication records connected to the loan process. Several names appeared repeatedly. One of them belonged to Linda. I stared at the page for a long moment. Until then, part of me had hoped Thomas acted alone. Not because it would excuse anything, but because it would preserve at least one relationship. Ethan carefully chose his words. "The documentation suggests she was aware of major decisions." I nodded slowly. Somehow that hurt almost as much as everything else. Linda had attended family holidays for more than 40 years. She knew what the house meant to my parents. She knew what it meant to me. Yet the records suggested she stood beside Thomas while these decisions unfolded. As difficult as those discoveries were, the most important revelation came near the end of the meeting. Ethan opened a final folder and removed several pages. "We located additional estate records," he said. "Records that were never included in the county file." My pulse quickened. He handed me a photocopy. The moment I saw the signature, I recognized it. It belonged to my father. Beneath it was language confirming his intention that ownership remained shared equally between his children. Not suggested. Not implied. Confirmed. Clear and direct. For several seconds, I could not speak. The room felt completely silent. My father had documented exactly what he wanted. The question was no longer whether his wishes existed. The question was how those wishes disappeared from the official story. Ethan leaned forward. "Margaret, This document changes everything. I looked down at the page again. Years of confusion suddenly aligned into a single realization. Someone had not merely hidden information. Someone had replaced the truth with a more convenient version. And for the first time since this began, I felt something stronger than uncertainty. I felt prepared. 3 days after my meeting with Ethan, an opportunity appeared that neither of us had expected. Thomas called and invited me to a family gathering at his house the following Sunday. His tone sounded unusually upbeat. He spoke about reconnecting, spending time together, and moving forward as a family. Under different circumstances, I might have welcomed the invitation without hesitation. Instead, I immediately sensed there was another reason behind it. After ending the call, I contacted Ethan. He listened quietly before offering a simple suggestion. "Go," he said. "Sometimes people reveal the most when they believe the outcome is already decided." Sunday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. I drove to Thomas's house shortly before noon. Several relatives had already gathered in the backyard. Folding tables were arranged beneath large shade trees. Children played near the fence while adults carried plates of food and exchanged casual conversation. On the surface, it looked like any ordinary family event. Yet beneath every smile, I felt tension. Thomas seemed especially confident. He moved through the crowd, greeting people and laughing more loudly than usual. Linda appeared equally relaxed. More than once, I caught them exchanging knowing glances. The behavior reminded me of people preparing for an announcement. About an hour after I arrived, Thomas tapped a glass with a spoon and asked everyone for their attention. Conversations faded. Chairs shifted. Faces turned toward him. Standing near the center of the yard, he cleared his throat and smiled. "I wanted to share some news with the family," he began. His voice carried easily across the gathering. He spoke about simplifying responsibilities, reducing stress, and making practical decisions for the future. Then he mentioned the family home. A strange silence settled over me. Thomas explained that maintaining the property had become difficult. He spoke as though every decision had already been made. He described plans that sounded remarkably final. Listening to him, I realized he truly believed the situation was under control. He believed his version of events would remain unchallenged. Several relatives nodded politely. Others looked uncertain. Then Thomas said something that changed the atmosphere entirely. "As sole owner, I have done what I believe is best." The words hung in the air. Sole owner. I noticed several family members glance toward me. Before anyone could speak, another voice entered the conversation. "That assumption may be the problem." Ethan stepped forward from the side of the yard. Thomas froze. Linda's expression changed instantly. Surprise gave way to concern. Ethan remained calm. He introduced himself to the relatives who did not know him, and then placed a folder on the table. No accusations. No raised voices. Just documents. One by one, he presented records. Property filings. Estate records. Financial documents. Finally, he produced the copy containing my father's signature and clearly stated instructions regarding equal ownership. The reaction was immediate. Confusion spread across faces throughout the gathering. Thomas stared at the papers without speaking. Linda looked down at the ground. For the first time since this began, nobody was controlling the narrative anymore. The documents were speaking for themselves. Ethan carefully explained that significant questions remained unresolved and that further legal review was already underway. As he spoke, I watched my brother. The confidence that had filled the yard only minutes earlier slowly disappeared. In its place was something I had not seen before. Uncertainty. And standing there among family members who now understood only part of the truth, I realized the final chapter of this story was about to begin. The weeks that followed moved more slowly than I expected. Once the documents had been presented, the situation entered a process that felt far less dramatic than the discoveries that led to it. There were meetings, reviews, additional records, and conversations with people who specialized in untangling complicated histories. Through it all, Ethan remained steady. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, he reminded me that facts have a way of surviving even when people try to bury them. Eventually, the full picture emerged. The estate records, my father's written instructions, the timing of the property transfer, and the financial documents connected to the loan all pointed toward the same conclusion. The family home had never been intended to belong solely to Thomas. My father's wishes had been clear from the beginning. What happened afterward could not erase that reality. The lender eventually agreed to suspend further foreclosure proceedings while ownership issues were resolved. That alone felt like a victory. For the first time in months, I could drive past the old house without feeling a knot form in my stomach. The porch still stood. The oak tree still shaded the yard. The memories remained exactly where they had always been. One afternoon, several months after that gathering, I met Ethan at the property. He handed me a final packet of documents confirming the outcome. Ownership rights had been formally restored according to my father's intentions. The home would remain protected. I thanked him, but the words felt inadequate. Some debts cannot be measured in dollars. As we stood on the porch, Ethan smiled and said something I never forgot. Your father left more than a house behind. He left a record of who he was. After he drove away, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Dust floated through beams of sunlight near the windows. The rooms were quiet. Yet the silence felt different now. Not empty, peaceful. I walked through the house slowly, stopping in places that carried special memories. The kitchen where my mother baked pies every Thanksgiving. The living room where my father read the newspaper every evening. The hallway where Thomas and I raced as children despite being told not to. For a moment, I could almost hear those echoes again. Thomas and I spoke only once after everything was settled. The conversation was brief. There were no dramatic confessions, no emotional speeches, no sudden repair of old wounds. Some distances cannot be crossed simply because people wish they could. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. Regretful, perhaps. But I no longer needed explanations. The documents had already provided those. When we parted, I felt sadness more than anger. I had not lost my brother during the investigation. The loss had happened years earlier, hidden beneath choices neither of us could undo. As autumn arrived, I spent more time at the family home. I repaired loose boards on the porch. I planted flowers near the front walkway. I opened windows and let fresh air move through the rooms. Little by little, the house felt alive again. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest lesson had nothing to do with property or money. It was about trust. Trust should be given with love, but never surrendered completely. Families are strongest when honesty protects them. And sometimes the most valuable inheritance is not a house, a bank account, or a piece of land. Sometimes it is the courage to defend the truth when nobody else will. Standing on that porch